Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third episode of our podcast series where we talk about everything related to dogs and the canine world in all its disciplines. We're going to dedicate this third episode to talking about the content of the second episode of the documentary series Dog Education that we published a few days ago on April 21st, called Behaviorism and Ethology. So, I suggest and encourage you that if you haven't watched the second episode yet, or even the first one, to check them out before continuing with this podcast, because if not, you're going to be totally out of context for some of the things we're going to talk about. This podcast will be longer due to many topics: content, style, tone, structure, the second dog education episode format, and follower questions. We start with a more educational and technical tone, offering more information, and the format of the second episode of the dog education series, as well as questions from our followers. And I think we're going to start with the tone we've chosen for this episode, which is definitely more educational than the first one, with a lot more information, a bit more technical. And if you've seen the episode, you know that in the last part, we do a gag, we do a sketch, almost laughing at ourselves because we cut the conversation, we break that educational tone where it seems like I'm teaching, and then we're recreating a conversation that's genuine. Section, the last part. We do a gag, we do a sketch, almost laughing at ourselves because we cut the conversation, we break that educational tone where it seems like I'm teaching, and then we're recreating a conversation that's genuine. And that is real, that we have recurrently at home, which is, dude, simplify things a bit, make it all a little easier, don't be so wordy, in quotes, there's no need to be so technical, you're going to lose people, there are a lot of people who won't be able to handle it or who are going to get lost. So wordy, in quotes, there's no need to be so technical, you're going to lose people, there are a lot of people who won't be able to handle it or who are going to get lost. In the way you talk and hear, what happens is several things. So, the first thing is that I'm like this. Anyone who knows me isn't surprised by the way I talk, because I really am quite like this. The thing is that we're in a different context, where you come to sessions or training and I use a different tone, where I might use a lot of swear words or different types of analogies to try to instill the information I'm giving. And then there's something that's true in my head and in my reality, and that is that I'm not just talking to one person who has a dog, to an everyday person who has a dog and who wants to understand it better and improve their relationship, or someone who has a problem with their dog and is trying to figure out what to do or how to help them. I'm talking to a lot of people at the same time. And I'm talking to professionals in my own field, I'm talking to professionals from other fields, because, for example, in the first episode where I talk about how the brain triangulates and processes the loss of a loved one, if a neurologist or a doctor or someone who really knows what I'm talking about has issues with it, then that can trickle down and affect the rest of the people. So, I need to have the space and the freedom, so to speak, to use a tone and terminology and a way of communicating that is as accessible as possible for everyone, both for people who know way more than I do in their own disciplines that I'm drawing from, to inform or enrich my own, and then to people who may be totally new to this world and are looking for how to help them get through it. And then to be more specific and just look at my professional discipline, which is the canine world, I have to provide information, because I'm talking about approaches that I don't practice but that a lot of people make a living from those approaches, and there are a lot of people helping both dogs and people using the methodology of those approaches. So that's not an easy ground to walk on, and it's not the ideal place to be. Those currents, and there are many people helping both dogs and people using the methodology of those currents. So that's not an easy ground to walk on. And it's not the ideal place to be. I have to be honest with my reality, which is that I have not found the answers I was looking for through those two currents, and I have to argue why. So it's not easy. I can't just jump to the summary without having provided the prior context. And lastly, I don't believe in it. I believe that the answers are found in the nuances, not in the absolutes. It's really hard to find answers, or try to grow from, that kind of conversation. I firmly believe that the vast majority of people understand the things I say or have enough capacity to grasp what I'm talking about because it's not rocket science. The different thing is that you might have to put in some effort if you're interested in this world enough, and those of you watching this and listening to this are dog nerds. You already know that. You know you're dog nerds because my channel and our profiles aren't known by everyone. We don't have 500,000 or 1 million followers. We show up when people search and dive deep into the canine world until we pop up. And then the filters that listen to the rants I go on, and I haven't said anything until this episode about our view of the canine world, and still, you're here. So you're dog nerds who can afford to watch it 2 or 3 times if you're interested, and draw your own conclusions from the things I say. And that's it. And draw your own conclusions from the things I say. And that's it. What do I mean by this? Well, basically, you're going to get 5-minute summaries that are super easy. But first, you're going to have to sit through the background info and the details that support that final summary. And also the fact that everything we're posting is aimed at our son Neil. It's important for us that he understands our passion, dedication, and logic in our work, applicable to any life area. All the content we are creating, so you know a part of it from their parents, and that they understand the logic and how we try to reach conclusions or answers, and that they also see the passion, the dedication that we have put into something that we are passionate about, but that can be and should be translatable to anything, to any area of life that we have. You're passionate about. So it's really hard for us to become some other type of channel because this is basically who we are in a part of life that we've chosen to share publicly, which is our relationship with the canine world. In terms of the technical content we agreed on in the episode, we're going to try to break down the difference that exists, or what we find between what is generally understood as instinct and the term we've brought to the table, to the conversation, which is fixed action pattern. And we're also going to touch a bit on behaviorism and ethology. Let's remember the definitions we gave in the second episode about instinct and fixed action pattern. Instinct in behavior. It's understood as a series of inherited reflexes that are genetically activated. And what I argue in the episode is that the problem comes from the word reflex. And according to what we told you in the episode about a fixed action pattern, it was the ethology's attempt to break down the intuition people had about what instinct is into 3 smaller blocks. With the first block being an external stimulus that activates a switch with 2 positions, one for on and the other for off, which they call a fixed action pattern. When it's turned on, there's a sequence of physical movements, motor actions. That makes sense when it comes to maximizing the individual's survival. In other words, an individual sees or has an interaction with whatever it is that whatever activates a switch, and that switch makes the body move. And you could rightfully say, what good does this do for me? And the answer is, it's useful for many things. What good does this do for me? And what it's good for is many things. The thing is that these things depend on the level of prior information you have. We received a question for this podcast from someone joining the neuropsychology and dog training. He is a behaviorist and curious about canine understanding. His question was, can fixed action patterns be controlled? Do we have an impact on them? I couldn't explain, but at the training, I'll show how we can influence these fixed action patterns. Without training, knowing what a fixed action pattern is can enhance your relationship with dogs. Can fixed action patterns be turned on and off at will? In other words, do we have an impact? Can we intervene in the activation of those fixed action patterns? Right now, I couldn't tell him why, but once he comes to the training, all I'm going to do is explain to him how to have an impact on those switches called fixed action patterns. But if you don't have that information he's going to receive in the training, there are other levels where being aware of what a fixed action pattern is can really help you a lot. And the impact it has on how you understand your relationship with your dogs. Because at this level where it can really help you. Knowing what a fixed action pattern is helps you describe and understand how you read the reality of the canine world. Because neurolinguistic programming is incredibly important in how we construct the reality we inhabit and perceive. Let's step away from the dog world for a bit. Let's visualize that hundreds of years ago, when people didn't have the information we have today to describe the world around us and how it works, back then, with their best attempts to explain reality, people would come up with some pretty wild stories about the whys, about the rain or storms or the harshness of the weather. When there was a hell of a storm, you could say, this is Thor getting pissed off at his brother because he owes him money or some crazy thing. And he released a hammer blow to the cloud and water is pouring down like crazy. But today we know perfectly well that it has nothing to do with any angry god, because we did not do things the way he liked, but that there is a scientific basis that explains not only why it rains or there is a storm, but also how it happens. But the end of the reality you're experiencing, no matter what you have in your head, is the same. You're getting hit by a hell of a storm. So, there are a lot of people who might say, damn, but if it doesn't change the fact that it's raining, what does it matter? Whatever I'm imagining in my head, what harm am I doing, or what's wrong with it, or what's negative about it? Why can't I create the story I want, or why isn't the story I'm creating valid? And I would say, you're absolutely right, because on that particular level, nothing is going to change for you. It's still going to rain. But the real difference is that with an accurate reading, based on science, you have the ability to predict when it's going to rain, to know almost for sure when it's going to rain, how many liters of water are going to fall, where that storm is headed, and where it's coming from, while with the other explanation, you have absolutely no access to anything other than describing a reality when it's happening. Let's bring in an example that's closer to what we're interested in, which is dogs. Imagine, or try to visualize that I'm part of a couple, that I have another guy who is my partner, and that we adopted a dog. And in everyone's eyes, that dog is really scared. And what happens with those kinds of terms when they're not very well defined is that the interpretation of those words depends on the person who's observing. And that's when it's less problematic. Why? Because if my partner is much more sensitive than me, when we see a situation in which the dog is afraid, he will want to protect, he will want to give security, he will want to calm, he will want to love that dog, and if I'm one of those old-school macho types, I'll say, that dog is just a wuss. Those old-school types will say, that dog is just a scaredy cat. That dog, what it needs to do Because it's not the same to think that the dog is scared, poor thing, or to think, well, this dog is just like that, and there's nothing that can be done. So, the importance is huge. And how does a fixed action pattern help you? By taking away the whys. By taking away a ton of conversation and narrative, which is part of the subjective reality you're experiencing, to make way for a more objective reality, which is what we're trying to help people with. 2. Differentiate and learn to read and inhabit. The objective reality that allows you to see, read, and understand things for what they are, as far as knowledge goes, and to remove as many subjective words as possible. So, if I tell you that traditionally urine has been understood as marking territory, what does that imply? Well, a whole bunch of things that are then going to steer your thinking and your conversation, because you're going to want to adapt or adjust everything else to that vision you have. But any dog will pee on another dog's pee. All dogs. All dogs. It doesn't matter what age they are, it doesn't matter what breed they are, it doesn't matter at all. A dog smells another dog's pee and is going to pee on it, and it's just a switch being flipped. If that lets you avoid a conversation that might not be accepted, damn, there's a lot of work to do. Before you build, you have to deconstruct. And this is a job that takes time because you don't just start seeing life differently overnight. Before you build, you have to deconstruct. And this is a job that requires time because one does not go from seeing life differently to another overnight. Extrapolating or confronting ethology with behaviorism reveals their methodological differences. In explaining behavior, behaviorism posits that all creatures are essentially the same, blank slates shaped by interactions with the world, defining who we are and what we do. In contrast, fixed action patterns suggest the opposite. In behaviorism, everything depends on it. Because in behaviorism, all creatures, all animals, no matter what they are basically the same. Regardless of what kind of creature you are, we are all blank slates waiting to have interactions with the world around us. So we can then write who we are and what we do, or what we do to define who we are. Meanwhile, the understanding of the existence of fixed action patterns and how they get activated says the complete opposite. They say that we are not all the same and that there are specific switches for each species. While the understanding of the existence of fixed action patterns and how they get activated says the complete opposite. They say that we are not all the same and that there are specific switches for each species. That's already a huge difference between how one group of people sees it and how another group sees it. In ethology, things are studied, experimented on, and confirmed experimentally, like, for example, if you raise a squirrel in a lab and only give it liquid solutions to eat, like serum, milk, whatever you want. At 2 years old, you put a nut in front of it and the squirrel knows how to open the nut. It has never seen a nut, never had any interaction with a nut, and no one has explained it to her, but she has a switch inside that corresponds to her species. She knows her job. The difference between ethology and behaviorism is that in behaviorism, the squirrel's nut opening is a reflex. Ethology sees it differently. The squirrel can improve its nut opening skills with practice, becoming more efficient and gaining more nutrients. Nothing can be done with it. You can't improve it. You can't do anything with it because it's a reflex. Like blinking, you can't control it or have any impact on it. On the other hand, in the view of ethology, the squirrel has that switch that allows it to open the nut. But if you keep giving it nuts, eventually the squirrel develops greater abilities to open them, more easily and quickly, getting more nutrients in less time. It perfects that switch it has inside genetically. That's everything we're trying to argue in this episode, that fixed action patterns need to be contextualized, improved, learned, and developed according to life experience. That switch it has inside genetically. That's everything. We're trying to argue in this episode that fixed action patterns need to be contextualized, improved, learned and developed according to life experience. And then, really, the scientific community doesn't use the term instinct too much. So this turns into, oh, your dog has a strong hunting instinct, or your dog has a strong protective instinct. Throw almost anything and you get almost everything that you can't explain. Then this becomes that your dog has a lot of hunting instinct. It's that your dog has a strong protective instinct, so when it gets lumped into that bag, we can't do anything because it was meant to happen, it was going to happen, and it's just a reflex. It's an intrinsic part of how the animal is going to behave. Well, that's a way to cut off conversations at a point where you could keep digging into the discussion, because I run into that kind of situation professionally all the time. So, when we have knowledge of what fixed action patterns are, we debate internally, we try to argue the pros and cons, and we come to the conclusion that it really is about the value smaller than we can measure or interpret objectively. Well, the next question, if you apply first principles logic, is how does that work? How do they get plugged in, and how do they not? How do we know when one needs to be plugged in and when it doesn't? How do we know if it's natural, if it's what's needed? How do we know when one needs to be plugged in and when not? When do we know, and how do we know if it's natural, if it's what's needed? So, that's where all our research work comes in. And then there's one last part that, of course, I have to take full responsibility for, and the authorship is entirely mine, which is that I say that neither of the two methodologies has helped me find a definition of well-being. Animal and how to get there, so I'm still searching. That's my experience. It just means there are people who have found it. I haven't found it. I haven't found the answers to the questions I have or had when we started this whole experience or journey into the canine world and how to understand it in the best way possible. And that leads us to the last segment, which is the questions from our followers. I haven't found it. I haven't found the answers to the questions I have or had when we started this whole experience or journey into the canine world and how to understand it in the best way possible. And so this leads us to the last segment, which is the questions from our followers. The next question, Nadal, I understand. It's the one from Mikel Imenguo, 7, which is, if neither of the two approaches has given you a definition or tools to achieve well-being, what do you understand by animal welfare? So, I think it's important to know how you define it so we can get oriented. And that's the question. What you had to do after watching the second episode. It's the most straightforward, it's the most basic. I've never said, in all the years we've been on social media, anything about how we see the canine world. We've never told you what you have to do, we've never advised on whether one tool or the other. In the book, I'm going to provide all the information and content that makes up our vision of the canine world and how we apply it, and once that becomes public knowledge, then I'll have the ability to make videos about the information I've already published. And that's the path we've chosen to follow, and the day will come when, either through the book or through videos, we can be much more specific and we can be technical and practical to help people without them needing to come to the shelter for sessions or training. And that's the path we've chosen to follow. We'll be more specific. We'll be technical and practical to help people without them needing to visit the shelter for sessions or training. We want to step back and let everyone access our research, education, and conclusions to keep moving forward. And we can be technical and practical to help people without them needing to come to the shelter for sessions or training. So basically, we want to step back and give everyone the chance to access the research and education work we've done so far and our conclusions to keep moving forward. But, can I give you a sneak peek? We have a definition of animal welfare that is based on neuroscience and neurology, which I will be able to express to you both in writing and in mathematical formulation. This is a definition that satisfies all the questions that we have in all our daily and continuous experience with all the dogs that we have access to. That helps and is helping many people, and that we consider should be in the public domain so that anyone has access to this information. We don't want it to be the excuse for charging people to come see us. We want the information we currently use in all our training sessions, which has taken us so much effort to organize and sequence into a coherent methodology, to be available so that everyone has access to it and so we can talk in the terms we use professionally. Let's keep going with more questions. Another one says, the importance of placing a balanced dog for adoption so that it can be a success. Here, I have to stay within a conversation range that relates to what we do and the intention behind our actions. For us it's crucial, it's fundamental, it's basic, that a dog going up for adoption doesn't just have to be balanced, which is the ultimate goal, but rather that they're in a range where, when you find someone who's going to adopt, it's the most informed decision possible. The aim is to find the ideal person for the needs of the dog that's being adopted. It's not just about them being balanced, which is the ultimate goal, but rather that they're in a range where, when you find someone who's going to adopt, it's the most informed decision possible. We're trying to find the ideal person for the needs of the dog that's going up for adoption. And there are no dogs in our shelter that go up for adoption if the needs we see are too high. Trying to find the ideal person for the needs of the dog that's going up for adoption. And there are no dogs in our shelter that go up for adoption if the needs we see are too high. In those cases, they stay with us until that situation changes or we find another type of person to take care of that particular dog, or they simply stay with us at the shelter. That's the intention. That particular dog, or they simply stay with us at the shelter. That's the intention. Of course, sometimes, depending on the moment, where you are, depending on the situation and the number of dogs, and the imbalance that each dog is creating in the rest of the group, there are times that if they ask you about him, it is natural that you get the eyes of Uncle Scrooge and you want to execute the sale and the contract quickly. But you have to fight against that, know what you are doing things for and try to do it as best as possible. Another question that says, I think the dog does not need us, but that we have made him meet us. What do you think? I believe that the dog didn't exist within the natural world, and we've created it entirely. I mean, dogs would have never existed if it weren't for human intervention. They're wolves with far fewer resources or deformed wolves. To really call it what it is, another thing is that we have a huge emotional investment in those deformed wolves, but those aren't characteristics that nature would have created organically and naturally. Would have created organically and naturally. So, from there, the dog needs us. The dog has opened its eyes and said, Dad, Mom. They are designed. Genetically, they are genetically modified to depend, in quotes, on the relationship they have with humans. But that doesn't take away from the fact that, of course, they can live in the wild because they have all the resources or they have many resources from the animal that came before them. So, of course, if there's no human intervention, they have skills that they put into practice to survive. But that doesn't mean that's their design. Their design, their reason for existing is to live with humans. Historically, no one has spent 15 or 30,000 years breeding dogs just to abandon them, except in this last phase of history that we suddenly find ourselves living in. If the dog is a pack animal, is it normal for the disintegration of the group to make it uncomfortable? Is that a line of thinking? That is based on a premise I don't agree with, because the dog itself is not a pack animal. The wolf was a pack animal. That doesn't exclude the fact that the dog is a social animal, but not necessarily a pack animal in the way it's understood in the wild. Because in the wild, packs have their hierarchies, they have their defined roles, and a lot of people who are dedicated to the study of wild animals that are infinitely more competent than I am in their professional disciplines, they tend to, and they give you the rest of the information, that in the wild there are hierarchies, packs, and roles. But, from my professional and life experience in the canine world, I don't understand how that translates to the dog. So, from my view of the canine world, I cannot share the premise that the dog is a pack animal. The dog is a social animal that is genetically designed and created to live with humans. Another thing is what is happening today. There are many abandoned dogs living in the wild, not in Spain, but in other countries, and the narrative of pack to dog was not very useful in explaining reality. I don't share that view. So, when you believe or when you interpret, and I say, you, as in any person interpreting, that it's because it's a pack animal, the fact that when the family separates, the dog goes to the member who is leaving and tries to bring them back to the group or even marks them to bring them back to the group. That, for example, has more to do with hurting really than with the discomfort of the family not being together because we are a pack. That, for example, has more to do with hurting really than with the discomfort of the family not being together because we are a pack. Another question says, I would like you to talk about how our emotions affect the dogs we live with. This is something that's obvious. This is something that's been scientifically proven. I have a little problem with the word emotion because I don't think it's the right one. I don't think it represents the conversation. We talked about this in the first episode, and we did it with animated drawings to simplify it a lot. The word emotion comes from the word emotio, which means impulse or movement. An emotion is designed. It's an electrical impulse that's meant to get your body moving. Emotion is used loosely, without a clear definition. It interferes with understanding the canine world. It's not the best word, but your expression is clear. And it's not that I'm being tedious with the definitions because I want to. It's just that, later on, when you don't have a good definition of emotion, it's going to create a lot of interference in how you're reading and interpreting the reality of the canine world. So, it's not the most appropriate word, but what you want to say, what you want to express is totally. That's true. This is an important part of the communication work that we do. This is scientifically proven, but it doesn't answer what people think it answers, and it's not about emotions, it's about what really underpins the impact we have on the dogs we live with. And it's not about emotions, what it really stands for. The impact we have on the dogs we live with. Another question says, can a dog that was initially calm when adopted change at home because of the experiences it has lived through? What seems to me is a misreading, a misunderstanding of the dog at some point by someone that is having repercussions over time. Someone thought the dog was doing great. This understanding was passed to the current owner. The dog is struggling. That way of understanding the dog has been transmitted to the person who now lives with the dog, and that has been their reality, because perhaps they did not have more knowledge. And then things start happening, and the dog isn't doing so great anymore. To me, that's a misreading and a poor assessment about the dog. And when that happens, the person trying to figure out what's going on is going to create a lot of stories based on their understanding. And that's what we do professionally, changing that whole conversation and explaining what you see for what we really believe it is. Has the canine world evolved, or the complete opposite? I am an optimist. I am an optimist inside a grumpy person's body. But I'm an optimist by nature. So let me just say that we're really trying to truly and genuinely enrich the conversation in order to help to move the proverbial needle, and we sincerely and wholeheartedly believe it will naturally shift on its own without getting stuck in any kind of negative or positive reinforcements, because they are already completely squeezed dry, and everyone knows everything about that methodology. Yet, there are still many problems in the canine world, and there are many issues with understanding within the canine world. So, if we didn't believe that it's evolving and that it will continue to evolve, it wouldn't be possible for us to do what we're doing to help speed things up to where it needs to go. Another question: what stands out to you the most about a dog when you meet it? When I see a dog, whether it's in a professional context or just out in public, like taking a walk down the street, I try to get a sense of the dog's state, how long it's been kept in that condition. And then I try to get an idea of the impact that the handler is having, taking the dog in any direction. Basically, that's the first bit of information. And then I try to get a sense of the impact that the handler is having, taking the dog in any direction. Basically, the first information that my brain processes when I see a fish. Another important question, and I'm glad they asked it, is: why does it all seem easy when I hear it, but when I face my reality, it's not like that? Let's imagine you don't have any information from anyone else in the professional dog world except for me. So, I would take away a lot of responsibility right off the bat, because the information you have is biased. It's going to be a bumpy ride. I'm going to sense it, but I'm not going to explain it. You don't have all the tools for what I'm saying right now, so it doesn't necessarily mean you can do what we do, or solve problems, or build a relationship, or any of that. It doesn't have to. The information you have is minimal and biased. I repeat, imagining that you only had information from me. The second point is, we've done thousands of repetitions and spent thousands of hours working on a very specific way of seeing the world of affection and trying to make an impact in it. So there has to be a difference between someone who doesn't have the information yet, because they're just watching us in videos, and people who have all the information, who live based on that information constantly, and they are constantly forced to implement it in practice because we live with a huge dog. But it's a huge opportunity to turn a feeling that's already inside you, which can create frustration, and that frustration can lead to the next step and learning to live with what you have in a functional way. I'm not going to let this go. And learn to live with what you have in a functional way. To understand it for what it is, which is that everyone can do more or less what we do. Almost anyone can reach a point where you can enjoy a much deeper level of the relationship with your dog. And this is what I always say: you don't have to be Rafa Nadal to enjoy playing tennis. Not everyone has to have a very high level to enjoy their dog. It's easier. It's actually easier than it seems, really easier than it seems. And that's part of your voluntary decision to make that the narrative. When you keep watching the videos, or when you keep trying, or thinking, I'll never be able to do it. It's almost a voluntary decision, so it's a really good opportunity to start shaping things. How do you program your brain neurolinguistically? And the last question, which is actually two, is what do educating children and dogs together have in common? Or do you think the training you provide should be part of schools, high schools, or universities? It's hard to answer this question without sounding like a complete jerk. At some point, because I'm not going to say that what I do deserves to be taught as mandatory education in the Spanish educational system. All I'm going to do is put out all the information I have, all my conclusions, and all the arguments. Scientists behind it, so that it can then go through the filter of everyone who reads it or everyone who's interested in it. and if it went through the filters of experts, as it closely estimates reality, then I would love that. But not because it's mine, but as it passed all necessary filters to say, this is closest. But not because it's mine, but because it has gone through all the necessary filters of whoever needs to say, this is the closest estimate, and if it's not, we keep looking. That's all for now. Thanks for being there, for listening, and for being part of this journey, these conversations, and what really excites us, which is the world of dogs.